Hi everybody, I'm John Papa and I'm here with Burke, Holland, and TJ, and we're going to create a NativeScript application with Angular 2, and really excited to see what you guys can build.
Yes, we are. Let me see here. For those of us that are on Twitter, you can find us here, except for John. John doesn't need more followers.
Nope, no more.
Yeah, so if you're out there, don't follow John, but definitely follow TJ and I because we do need the followers. And we tweet a lot about NativeScript, so if you're interested in hearing about NativeScript, you can find us there. And of course, John has an excellent Pluralsight course on how to use Angular 2 that you should definitely check out as well. Highly recommended. So let's talk about what NativeScript is, John. NativeScript is an open source framework for building truly native mobile apps with JavaScript using web skills like TypeScript, Angular, which we're talking about today, CSS, and getting native UI performance on iOS and Android.
So that's a mouthful. Can I ask you a few questions about this?
Sure. That's the 50-word positioning statement from marketing. So
that's awesome.
It's obligatory, yeah.
So Angular, you're meaning Angular 2? Or can I also use Angular 1?
No, we're meaning Angular 2. Angular 2 only, and we'll talk about that.
Great.
Today.
So there must be a reason behind that decision as well.
Yes, there is. Yes, absolutely.
Yep, the short answer is Angular 1 tied to the DOM, coupled to the DOM, and in NativeScript, we're not using the DOM. So Angular 2 only for that reason, if nothing else.
Right, and that's an important piece of NativeScript is that you have your own view layer.
Correct. We have our own renderer, and because Angular 2 is smart enough to decouple itself from a dependency on the renderer, they actually work really well together.
So you basically get, if we did the MVC type model, you're basically getting the MC out of this from NativeScript, whereas the view itself is the piece you guys have just popped on top.
Correct. That's absolutely right.
Okay, so if I go down this NativeScript path, you're saying it's a truly native mobile app.
Yes.
What does that mean with the code? Does that turn into native code on iOS, Android, or how does that work?
So the code you write is actually TypeScript code or JavaScript code.
Great.
And we do not compile it in any way. So we're not there's no build step that turns it into, say, Objective-C or Java or anything like that. So at a high level, what we're doing is we're actually embedding a JavaScript virtual machine. So the piece of software that actually runs Java or JavaScript code. We're using it much in the way like a browser uses a JavaScript VM. So if you think of how Chrome uses V8, for instance, it embeds that and uses that to run JavaScript in the browser. And we're essentially taking a similar approach with iOS and Android. We're taking your JavaScript or TypeScript code, we're running it in that VM, but the magic of NativeScript is that we're bridging that to native code so that you can actually invoke native APIs, you can build native
And this
user
is not
interfaces.
the same as a web view, right? So like normal hybrid type apps where you write JavaScript and you basically run a web view inside of a mobile app. So this is right on the VM.
And that's the key difference because the web view really limits the performance of what the device can do.
Right.
And even by definition, if you look at Steve Jobs' thoughts on Flash letter, he says HTML5 is the future, even running inside a lower power. He says we even provide a lower power version of our lower powered browser on the device. And so that's sort of the hybrid apps, which are amazing, but unfortunately are...
Okay, so if I could kind of position this then, you've got pure web app looking at a browser on a mobile device, and then you've got the next level would be like a hybrid app, right? Maybe running something like an Ionic type thing that's out there inside of a web view.
Correct.
And then you've got something like NativeScript or Xamarin, for example.
Right.
So NativeScript runs inside of a VM, and then you've got the Xamarin or the full native app, which actually is native on the device.
Right. Yes, that's exactly correct. Cool. So we had a big announcement yesterday in our keynote about NativeScript 2.0, which now provides full support for Angular 2. We've been talking about it for a while, but thanks to the fact that the Angular team made a few changes over the last 12 months.
Just a few.
Just a few. But now we're at release candidates, so we're pretty stable, except for the fact that they broke it into smaller modules like 2 days before ngconf and send us an email. Yeah, we now have full support for Angular 2 inside of NativeScript, and that's what we're going to be doing today. We're gonna build something.
And we're going to build this on the RCs that are out?
We're going to build this on the Angular 2 RC, and is that correct?
We're going to be using Beta 15 today.
Beta 15
today. But it'll work with the RCs too.
Yes.
I think, at the time of this recording, it might be out-ish, but the demos that we record are on Beta 15, so we'll be using that for today's demo.
Awesome. And the idea is that you can now use the same Angular 2 that you would use to build for the web, and you can render it to a mobile device, and that there's a huge amount of code sharing that you can do between the two. Because Angular 2 is decoupled, you can reuse things like pipes and services and really a lot of your component logic as well, and then render to two different platforms instead of rendering to just one on the web and then trying to run that everywhere.
Is there anything you can't do in Angular when you're writing a NativeScript app? Like, is there any Angular features you should be avoiding, or is it pretty much it's open to you, other than view-specific things?
Yeah, so the views is the big thing. I mean, the obvious difference right off the bat is like your templates that you're going to use. Like you're unable to use things like divs and spans because iOS and Android, there's no equivalent.
It does no thought, right.
control. So that's the big thing. For the most part, all the other Angular concepts are going to work in NativeScript apps, and we'll see this in the demo momentarily, but services, directives, pipes.
So if somebody knows Angular too, they're going to have a really easy time writing code here.
Correct. So there are a few NativeScript-specific things that we're going to look at in the demo, but for the most part, the Angular 2 concepts that you're learning to build your web apps are skills that you can basically directly reapply to build for Android and iOS.
Can't wait to see it.
It's pretty close to being 1-for-1. So let's do it. You ready to see it?
Let's do it.
All right. So to get started, I'm going to pull up a terminal here. And we're going to create a new application. Now, of course, in order for all this to work, you have to have the NativeScript CLI installed. You can go to nativescript.org. There's a big green Getting Started button. Walks you through how to do all of this. Obviously, I have all that set up already, so we're just going to go ahead and rock and roll.
Okay.
We're going to create a new application. Actually, let me...
CLI, command line interface for those who may not.
Correct. Yes. Right. And NativeScript is an NPM library, so you just install it from NPM. And really, as long as you have your Xcode and your Android SDK set up correctly,
Right, because you still need those because you're going to be building to those specific devices.
Right. You're building locally. All right. So let's create a new application here. So we'll TNS create, and we're going to do the to-do MVC ripoff, and we're just going to pass in dash.
We're just making sure we pass it twice.
Yeah, right. We're going to pass.
Be very clear.
Right. Pass in dash ng, and that's going to specify that we want to use Angular 2 within inside of NativeScript.
So TNS is the CLI.
TNS is the CLI,
Telerik
correct.
NativeScript?
Yes.
Telerik?
Yes. You can also write NativeScript, create, and then all your commands, but it's easier to write TNS.
Yes.
Good question, though. So we're going to go ahead and do that, and it's going to create the application for us. And it's going to pull in everything that we need from NPM in terms of Angular 2 and RxJS and all the things that Angular 2 depends on, which is quite a lot of stuff. So
You're a brave man running an NPM install, basically, right here.
Right,
live.
I know, right? Almost as brave as you yesterday, live coding in 20 minutes. We started to do that, and I was like, oh, man, this is not going to go well. But you pulled it off. Yeah, it was really good. All right, so let's move into this directory, to our rip-off directory.
You know, you could.
Well, we're ripping off the styles from To-Do MVC. So just to be fair, we're borrowing.
Yes,
We're
we'll
inspired.
give them back when we're done.
Yeah, we're inspired. And now that we've done this, we want to just add in our specific platforms. So we're going to do TNS platform add Android here, and then I'm going to open up a new tab. Yes. So it'll
Android is a ripoff of Android.
That's right. TNS. Let's try that again. Let's do TNS platform add Android. Actually, make that mistake more than you would probably believe. And then I'm going to open a different window over here. I'm going to do TNS platform add.
And really what this is doing is, with NativeScript, you are building truly native iOS and Android apps. So this is a one-time command that basically does all the setup. Like, this is behind the scenes building an Xcode project for your iOS app. It's setting up all your Android setup for your Android app. But the great thing about NativeScript is this is really abstracted from you. Like, so your Xcode project does exist, and you can access it if you want to. But for the most part, it's just sort of behind the scenes.
I had a question. So on here, is there a way to get autocomplete or hinting with the TNS CLI?
Yep, there is. When you install it, it'll actually ask you a yes/no question, and we will add something to your Bash profile on Max.
Awesome, because CLIs are great, but sometimes you forget commands. And
yeah, it's a black box.
Fill them in for you.
For sure.
I saw you like typing things in, and like, wow, it'd be nice if we just kind of help fill you in as you want.
And the other thing too, if you want to show in Visual Studio Code, we have an integration. What's the proper term? Extension for Visual Studio Code.
I'd love to see that actually.
Yeah, we'll get into that here in a second. Here.
Burke will show that in a
so
second.
I'm going to go ahead and kick off a build here. So I'm just going to say TNS run Android, and I've got Genymotion running. So when I do that, it's just going to start running on Android. It's going to deploy it to my Genymotion device because it's going to detect that as a connected Android device.
And Genymotion being just an Android emulator, basically.
Yeah, correct.
More or less.
Right, because we've done some stuff with some other platforms for mobile. You have to not only build and then tell it's going to Android, you have to like put down the Android device type on your machine as well. So you're actually coming with TNS. Does it come with the install that you can actually run these emulators?
So it does not. So you can, we support a variety of different Android emulators, but you have to set them up on your machine.
Okay, so you did that in advance.
Exactly. So you could set up an Android AVD, Android virtual device. You could use Genymotion. If you are an Android developer and you have a very specific Android setup that you like, you can use those with NativeScript.
And that's all on your getting started?
Correct.
Box.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Correct. So now that we've got the project created, we've opened it in Visual Studio Code. We have an extension for Visual Studio Code. NativeScript is written in TypeScript. Angular 2 is written in TypeScript. Visual Studio Code has unbelievable support for TypeScript. We'll be using TypeScript today, although you don't have to use it. We do highly recommend the Visual Studio Code experience.
I assume you can use Sublime or
you can use whatever you want. Right. Yeah. And for the Telerik platform, we offer an extension for Visual Studio. And if you hate yourself and you want to use Eclipse, you can do that too. Right. I don't want to.
The same guy who wrote Eclipse wrote Visual Studio Code.
Are you serious?
Yes. That was one of his early projects.
That's so ironic. Isn't it redemption though?
It is.
Wow. Okay, so this is the folder structure. Let's take a look at this for a minute. Inside of this folder structure, we got a couple of different files here. Of note, we have a main.ts file. And if we take a look at this thing, you'll see some stuff that looks very similar to what you would see in an Angular app. The most important difference is that we have a NativeScript bootstrap as opposed to the Angular bootstrap. The reason for this is that we could have extended the native bootstrap and had you pass in maybe an additional parameter, but we thought that would be a little bit confusing for people coming in, not expecting it to work that way.
This is also the point of Angular 2 with this bootstrap main TS. Some people wondered why we have a main TS, and like in our style guide, we have main TS and then we have the app component. It's like your shell generally.
Right.
Why not just put it all in the app component? Part of this reason is you might want to target different platforms.
Yep.
Yes.
So this gives you the opportunity to have a very short file that's like, hey, where am I kicking this thing off for?
Yep, and the naming convention here too with main TS, app component TS, it's important to remember this is an Angular 2 app after all. So like the same sort of conventions, the style guides, for instance, are the sort of things that you can follow in here as well. And we've tried to stick with that as best we can.
Yeah, and so exactly what you said, you see an app component.ts the same way that you would expect to see it. And then let's take a look inside of this thing for just a second. So we're bringing in an Angular core here, nothing really different there. And then we have a component annotation and a selector. Now in NativeScript, the selector for the top level element doesn't matter. So all native apps have sort of a top level page or a view stack that you're going to cram everything into.
Which is different than Angular, web.
Right, different from the web.
Give it that tag.
Right, so in your top level page, this is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. It could be anything. Right. And then you'll notice the template. This is the big difference between NativeScript and the web. This is obviously not HTML. We use a special markup that gives you native components.
That looks really familiar.
Yes, it does. It may surprise you to know that some of the engineers who worked on this did XAML in the past. So yeah, it feels a little XAML-y. One thing you will notice though is that you have a stack layout which functions very much like a div. It lays things out vertically or horizontally if you change the orientation. And we'll look at some of these layouts today. And then you have a label. This gives you a native label. This gives you a native button. And then you'll see here that the syntax that we're using is exactly the same template syntax that Angular 2 uses.
So we get the same property binding and the event binding.
Property and event binding is all the same, which is really, really nice. So once you learn that template syntax, which is actually very easy once you understand it, it now just works. So in this case, sorry, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so whereas, back to the point of the different bootstraps, so what Angular 2 on the web is going to do with this template is it's basically going to like inner HTML it, right? It's going to parse it, handle those bindings and those sort of things. So on our end, what we're doing is we're taking each of those little components that you type there, and we're actually translating it to a native UI component. So you type label, but behind the scenes, we're turning that into a UI button when we actually render this thing out on iOS. And much like Angular 2 will implement all the different sort of things like add child, remove child, all the various DOM things they need to do, we re-implemented those same methods with native code so that the same syntax that you use in your templates is going to continue to work.
So while I have a button XAML element here, for lack of a better term, your view element. What do you call your thing? So I just call it the right thing.
UI components.
Yes, just UI
So you have a button UI component. It's actually creating an iOS native button or a Android native button.
Yes, you're getting the native counterpart.
We're not getting those lags we used to get if we did some kind of a hybrid-based model.
Correct. That is exactly right, which is a lot more seen when you get into list views and when you get into multi-touch. Right. So every component that we have supports tap, double tap, pan and zoom, long press, so all of the different touches that you would expect on a mobile device.
That's great, because that's a lot of the counter-arguments I hear against a lot of the hybrid, or you write JavaScript and you get an app, is that, wow, if you do that, you can have performance issues. So we're not going to have as much with doing this.
Well, and it's hard to support touches on the web because the implementations are so different. You have pointer events, and a lot of that stuff is done in JavaScript. And just to be clear, hybrid apps are a fantastic solution for many use cases, and sometimes native apps are the right solution. So while we do say that there are advantages over hybrid, I just want to be clear that we also do a lot of hybrid at Telerik.
Yeah, I do hybrid too. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this should give you a little bit more of a notch up on performance for things like long lists or touch.
Exactly, yes. Everything should just work at 60 frames per second the way that you would expect it to if you just opened up Xcode and started to code or Android Studio.
That's awesome, especially if you're trying to get approval from somebody who, if you don't make the decisions, it's your company.
Right.
We're getting to use mobile. These are the kind of questions you get.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so we could look through this code a little bit more, but let's just jump over and look at the application. So I'm going to jump over to Genymotion here. And here's the application. It doesn't look great.
It's amazing.
Yeah, isn't it beautiful? It's stunning. And then you can tap this button, and when you get down to the bottom, you've unlocked a tap achievement. Not really a whole lot there. So we're going to extend this thing. We're going to make it prettier, and we're going to turn it into a to-do list.
Okay.
So the first thing that I want to do here is, and I'm going to do some things right off the bat that are going to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, I think, but we'll refactor that and make it cleaner. Okay. So one of the things is I'm going to stick a class of to-dos inside of our component here, and we're going to use this class of to-dos to create a list or an array of these things, and then we're going to ng4 over those different items and create a list of them on the mobile application. So I'm going to come down to my component here, my component class. I'm going to get rid of all of this stuff in here. Let's take out all of this code. We don't need any of this anymore.
That was the tapping code, right?
That was that was the tapping code. Let me pull my snippets here so you don't have to watch me type. Let's grab this to-dos array, copy it to the clipboard here, and we'll just drop this right here. So I've created what we're going to call a to-do store, and it's just an array of to-dos. And for those who don't use TypeScript and you're wondering what this bracket annotation here is, do you want to talk a little bit about what that is, John?
Yeah, so here you have a to-do class that you define up top, right? Those are
Correct.
to-dos. And we're saying it's an array of those to-dos. The brackets are generic. So it says, okay, you can't stick a number in there. You can't stick a string. It's got to be that to-do type.
Right, and one of the things that I love about TypeScript, and then also when you're iterating over that thing, it knows what sort of objects are inside and gives you that intelligence.
So you get IntelliSense on them now.
Right. So let's pull in some constructor here. So I'm going to come down to code and grab our constructor. And I really wish a guy from Eclipse who built Visual Studio Code, can you please fix the indentation on a Mac so that you can paste, right, Command-Shift-V should maintain the indentation when you paste. I would really like that.
Why are you picking up eggs before you stalk me?
Well, because we don't want to be hungry. I mean, you're very busy, you do a lot of P90X, we're trying to keep up.
We might be hungry while we're stalking you.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the big thing.
Yeah. So. And basically all we're doing here is we're adding some items to this to-do store array. Nothing fancy. And then lastly, I think we need to get this thing into our markup here. So we've got a bit of markup. We call it markup, but it's actually XML. And remember, XML is like violence. If it's not working, you're not using enough of it. Right. And so XML actually terrible for data, fantastic for user interfaces. And now we've got a lot of markup here. I'm going to zoom out on this, and I hope it doesn't get too small for people so we can see things a little bit better here. But we'll...
And not to do this now, but because we want to see it all in one place to learn it, but you could pull this out into another file?
Yes, absolutely.
Because you could have a big template.
Correct. And you could use, this is an Angular 2 app, so if you wanted to build little components for this, sort of define inputs, outputs.
You could make the button be its own component. You could make, could make
exactly.
them all. They could compose each other.
Yeah, we're just putting it in one place here, just so easily for demo purposes.
Yeah, and I actually jumped ahead a little bit. I was looking at this markup. I'm like, that's really complex for this soon in the demo. That's what I wanted right there. That looks a lot better, doesn't it? All right, so we have that stack layout. Remember we said these work like divs. So we have a div. You can think of this as a div, and then another div. And then we're saying ng4 to-do of to-do store. And we're having a text field with a one-way binding. The text to be the to-do.title, which comes from the class to-do.title, right?
And so those people who are watching and using the new RC, on line 17, the hash to do will now be let space to do.
Really? So it will be, here, right here. So it will be like this.
In the new syntax, yes.
Okay. Hey, I'm glad you're here to tell us that. Would have used hashes forever. All right, so let's jump over to our command line. And what I want to do here is I want to stop this. And because we're going to be iterating a lot, making a lot of changes, we just want to see those changes show up. And so we have a live sync command that we can run on Android. And we can also tell...
Spelled it wrong
again.
And you got a thing for Android.
Android?
What is an Android?
Oh, I don't know, but it's something you can get a cream for. And then I'm going to throw in a watch flag here. And what this will do is it will build, deploy to Android, and then it will watch the file system. And anytime we change something, it will actually go ahead and do a hot refresh for us on the device so that our build cycle becomes really, really fast.
That's awesome, like a live reload or browser sync.
Correct, exactly. Because obviously you don't want to have to do a complete rebuild of Android every single time.
Could you also do it at the same time? Could you have it watch and show it in Android and iOS emulators at the same time?
Yes, you can.
Yep.
Yeah,
Awesome.
you can do both.
And the reason this is possible too is because of what we talked about earlier, because the JavaScript is being interpreted at runtime in the app. So it's a lot
You're
easier
not
for us.
building, you're
Exactly.
just interpreting it. Yep.
So it's easier for just to throw a file in and have the VM just interpret it.
How long does it take for it to refresh and load? Just
Look at that
moments
right there.
or-
It's telling me use let instead. Downside of expressions is deprecated. John Papa says.
I think like right before we recorded this, I think we are actually using the RC because if you go back to your code there at the top, I
You've got
noticed
the scoped packages.
Yeah.
I noticed the scope package.
Very
So
top.
I wonder
It
if that
is-
will work. Actually, let's do this and we'll go back and see if this actually makes a difference here. But let's jump over.
By the way, when you're using Angular 2, a lot of the things that they deprecated, they keep them around for a little while. So
Yeah.
you don't hurt yourself.
Right, so you don't get burned.
This is a perfect example.
Yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah.
All right, so now we have a stack layout that's just rendering out the two items. It doesn't look very good, but we rendered over a collection and we created two text fields so we could go in here and edit these things. Of course, these are fully native components. All right, so let's extend this a little bit more. Let me go up here and grab my next snippet here. And we want to create an area where we can add new to-dos to our list. We want to add things to the array. So I'm going to grab this here, copy to the clipboard, and then I think I'm going to paste this here.
Are these classes CSS? Are they something specific?
Yes, so they are CSS. However, the CSS in NativeScript is a bit different from CSS that you'd use in a web app. So the syntax is the same, right? Like you've defined selectors, name value pairs, and we'll show some CSS here in a minute. But the way it works is a little bit differently, and we'll get into that momentarily.
That makes sense because it's not HTML it's going against, so it had to be some adjustments.
Yep, exactly. Each of these things, much like we're taking these templates or these UI components and running them native, we're doing the same thing with CSS rules. So if you type background color black, we'll interpret that and figure out what's the iOS and the Android equivalent of that, and we'll use that when we actually render out the control.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that I've added here, we'll look at this markup, then we'll jump down and look at the code. So we've got a label here. This is just going to be a logo label. Then we have a text field with a class of new to-do, so we can style this bad boy. And then ng model. Why not just use text here, John, with the brackets and the parentheses? Why ng model?
So I assume you want this to be something they can change.
That is
You're not
correct.
to want to tell them the to-dos and never let them change them?
Correct. Right. Once you say it's
You
a
will
to-do,
do this.
you have to do this.
I have an app idea now, though.
Right, but why can't I just say text and use that same bracket parentheses binding?
Yeah.
Because the text is a property of text field. Why ng model instead?
Well, the text, if we did it that way with the square brackets, we would get the value from the code, which you wrote down below, up into the view. But then when we make changes, it would never flow back down. So doing the ng model, it's a special directive in Angular 2, which allows you to get basically two-way data binding.
Right.
So I can change the value or I can get values from the component back up.
Right, and that's one of the things that makes Angular 2 so fast is that not everything is a two-way binding. And so...
And even these two-way bindings aren't really two-way data bindings.
Are they really not?
They're actually, it's a one-way up and then there's a one-way down. It's just wrapping two different commands together, so you still have one-way flow.
Nice. That was... I did not know that. Now, on a text field in a native app, when you enter into the field, and we won't see this in the Android emulator, you get the little soft keyboard pops up, right? And so we can specify what sort of key we want to show inside of that keyboard. We can do done, we can do OK, we can do search. We'll stick with done for now, so we can
And are those-
specify...
is that text or is that the type of key?
No, that's actually the key will actually say done, search, okay.
Gotcha.
So we're basically customizing the keyboard with an attribute.
Nice.
Right, really nice. And then on return press here, that's the event that we want to listen to. For those who don't know Angular 2, this is the binding syntax for binding to events. You have the
parentheses goes down
Right.
to the component and square brackets will go back up.
right. Very nice. And then I've changed this to let, and I'm really interested to see whether or not this actually works.
Live coding, let's go.
Right, and then add to do down here. There's not a lot to it. We're basically saying our to do store. Let's push in a new to do. We're setting it to this text. If you remember, this text is bound to the text field, and then we're just going to clear the text field back out again so we can add in a new item. So we'll go ahead and save this. And when I save this, the watch command will run on the CLI, and we'll update our application. So let's jump back over to Genymotion here. And as you can see now, we've got a
That's your empty to-do that you can type in.
T2, correct?
Yeah. The other thing I'll note too is that we also handled all the TypeScript compilation for you as well. You notice that we didn't do anything to set that up. So as part of the TNS create option, you have a tsconfig file.
So
which
it's running
we've-
TSC, the TypeScript compiler, for you?
Correct.
Yes.
Doing that under the hood.
You don't have to do any of that. We handle all of the build steps. There's
You
no
don't have to learn
configuration.
gulp, grunt,
Nope.
broccoli.
Nope.
But you do have a tsconfig file in your project if you do want to configure for the type of person that wants to really configure.
We can jump over and look at that here. If you go down here, you'll see the tsconfig, and you can see we just
does the translation for you.
That is correct, and it uses hooks, npm hooks. So you can see the before live sync, before prepare, before watch. But yes, you don't have to go in and go through this configuration hell. We just go ahead and take care of all that.
Well, that's important too, because like you want to exclude certain folders when you're doing TSC.
Right, exactly. And when you're using NativeScript, that platforms folder has an entire Xcode project and Android project in it. You do not want to push that into GitHub. And so you exclude that folder, you pull it down, you run the build, and then it gets added back into your application. Okay, so I got a little bit confused looking at that. Let's go back over to our emulator here. I've added a new to-do to learn some new Angular syntax. Press enter, and then it's added into our list. And because of the binding and the magic of Angular 2, it then just shows up in our NG4, which is really nice. Now you'll notice that this thing looks kind of disgusting at the moment, and part of that is because we have a CSS file here in the application already, and that's that sort of really fantastic click demo that we saw. That's the CSS here. So I'm going to pull all of this out, and if I do nothing else but pull out all that CSS, what you'll notice is this thing will refresh here in a minute, and you'll see that our application already looks a lot different, right? Because the CSS is no longer being applied.
Is this completely unstyled at this point?
Yes, this is like if you were building a native app, this is what you would get out of the box.
So could you put your cursor in the second one real quick?
Sure.
So you're getting a little bit of styling by default.
And that's just what Android does out of the box.
Right. So you're getting the Android native styling of what it will do by default, and you're not. And the reason I'm saying this, it's important to note that you're getting what comes with the device.
Yes. Yeah, and so your app will look different on different Android versions, for instance, because those native controls change a little bit.
Right.
All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to add in a little bit more markup here to lay out our to-do so that our to-do's in the center. On the left-hand side, we have a way to mark it complete, and on the right-hand side, we have a button to delete it. So that's what we're going to do.
Like a 3-column.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's collapse this here. I'm going to take out this text field here, and inside of it, I'm going to put some of that markup that we saw earlier, which is this grid layout.
So inside of that stack layout, you're embedding a grid layout, which is going to have a button, a text field, and a button.
Right. And then in the columns, we have auto, star, auto. Now, the way that NativeScript layouts or grids work is that for columns, you can specify a couple different things. Auto basically says, make the column as wide as the largest piece of content in that column.
And the entire column.
And the entire column, yes. Star says take up any remaining space, and then so we have a 3-column: auto, take up remaining space, and auto. You could also specify a number here, so you could say 30, 50, 60, 100, and that would be, they're not pixels, what are they?
We call them just device independent units. It's like it's down to like DPI.
DIU? Unlike a DUI.
Okay. Yeah. And the reason so the reason we do this, though, is this is most similar to how the native platforms work. Basically, this is the way that we can take what you code in your Angular template here and translate it to native in the most performant way, essentially.
So let's take a look at this markup here for just a second.
Could you do me a favor? Could you space after line 20 and 21, just like we can see, like between the button and the text field?
Yeah,
I think
let's
it'd be
do
easier
that.
to see.
Cool. We'll space them all out here. So if we look at this button here, we have a text expression. We're basically saying, if the to-do has been completed, then show this mess here. And this looks really scary, and we're going to talk about why this is the way that it is.
Okay.
And then we have a class expression over here that says, if the to-do is completed, we want you to apply these 2 classes. These are CSS classes.
Font awesome.
Font awesome, yes. We're headed in that direction. Basically, here we're saying put this in column 0. We have on the tap, every item in NativeScript you can tap. It's the same thing as a click. Toggle completion, which is a function we haven't created yet, but will. And then we have a text field down here, which is what we were looking at before with an ng model. And then what is this edited to do thing here? John, you want to talk about this?
If you're doing that, that means that you're going to be able to get a reference to that text field and use it somewhere else in here.
That is absolutely right. This is one of my most favorite things about Angular 2 is that you can actually use these template variables to get a reference to the thing, and then you can use it somewhere else. Now, we're actually not using it, but I wanted to include it. But just to show people what we could do is we could say remove, and then we could actually say edited to do. And then in our function, edited to do would be the parameter that we got in, which would be this text field.
Right.
It's really, really powerful stuff.
It's handy if you don't have a model. It's handy. Like we happen to have a model. We have a tree
Correct,
right here.
yes.
But so you didn't need it, but you can easily do it. It means you don't have to create a model for something you don't necessarily need.
Well, and in NativeScript, a lot of times you need a reference to the actual control. Like you saw yesterday, I don't know if you saw in TJ's session, but they were making things explode using native explosion effects. Well, in order to do that, you need a reference.
Very practical thing.
So you need a reference to
You need a
grab
reference
it.
to the actual UI component. And instead of having to go in and traipse through your stack to find that parent-child, you can just use that instead, and it's really, really nice.
It's cool.
All right, so the same thing on the button. We've got some scary escaped text here.
Food.
Yeah, and we're putting it in the last column. Columns are zero-based. We have a tap method. We're going to remove the to-do, and then we have a class as well. So let's go ahead and jump down here. We're building this up nice and quickly. And let me come back here to my snippets.
So all that XML looks relatively straightforward, other than the crazy little X, F00D stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's all pretty much standard stuff. So let's grab this. That wasn't exactly what I wanted, but I'll take it. And we'll paste it in. And so basically we're adding in those methods that we were binding to in the XML here.
I think you missed a line.
Did I miss a line?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's actually just not indented. Or
Okay.
wait, I
there
think
we
it's
go.
Control-Shift-F.
Control-Shift-F?
Or Command-Shift-F.
What does that do?
Does it
Format.
format the whole file?
Yeah.
Really? No, that does search.
Maybe it's Control-Shift-F.
Still valuable. Good to know, John.
Yes.
All right.
It's this.
Right. That motion. I do that and it works. All right. So let's look next here. We've added our events, and the next thing we want to do is add in some CSS to this thing. So I'm going to copy this to my clipboard, and we're going to come over here and how do I get rid of this? Well, now I can't get rid of it, John.
Command-B.
Command B. Files. We'll just click on the icon. When all else fails, click on the icon. So we have an app.css file, and some people may have asked themselves, how is this working? We're not specifying app.css anywhere. Well, that's because NativeScript automatically will use by convention an app.css file if you create one. But you can also specify the files that you want. This is important to know because iOS and Android have very different styles out of the box. And a lot of times you're going to want to normalize those, and in order to do that, you need files that are specific to iOS that are specific to Android. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm actually going to change this here. I'm going to rename this to app-common. And basically this file is going to hold all of the styles that we want across iOS and Android right here.
Okay.
And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my app component file, and I'm going to come up here, and in Angular 2, and actually, you know what? I'm getting sick and tired of all of this markup here, so let's move this. I'm going to say new file. We're just going to call it app.html. Now, TJ, if it's not HTML, why are we going to call it HTML?
Well, so it's sort of interesting. If you look at this markup, it's technically not XML, right? Because this Angular 2 syntax, the binding syntax, makes it invalid XML. So we don't really call it XML because it's not valid XML, and XML parsers will reject it, for instance. We use the HTML syntax basically because it just provides the best syntax highlighting in IDEs. Like you can see, for instance, Code
yeah, totally fine with it.
highlights this really perfectly. This is exactly what you'd expect. But really, it's just an Angular 2 template.
So out of the box, we use HTML because the tool will recognize it and give you color coding and highlighting.
Correct. Technically, the NativeScript framework will recognize any extension.
Thank you.
It's a common mistake I make.
Yep. So we're basically, and this works in Angular 2 as well, right? Your templates get wordy, you want them out of your code file, so you put them in a separate file, you bring them in. And then if we want to bring in a style file, we can say style URLs. So you should be noticing at this point that a lot of the Angular, this is starting to feel very familiar, right? Yep. If you wanted to include a style sheet, this is how you would do it in Angular 2. This is how you do it in NativeScript. And we called ours app common.
Yep, app-common CSS.
CSS. All right.
So if I had one for each platform, how would I specify that?
That's a good question. So what you do is you'd come up and say app, you do new file, and you would say app.android.css, and then you would do another new file here, and you would say app.ios.css.
Would I refer to both of those in that styles URL, or does it just pick up?
So what's going to happen is when you actually build this app, what the NativeScript CLI is going to do is inject, and basically it'll create two app.css files.
Okay.
It'll put into the Android app, it'll take the app.android.css, make it app.css, and put it in Android,
Okay.
and the same thing in iOS. So the reason that's kind of convenient is that you can just refer to the thing as app.css.
Okay, so if I hear you right, in styles URLs, if we were using those files right now, I would just refer to app.css and it would look and know that I'm going to grab app Android CSS or app to iOS CSS.
Correct.
That's correct.
And you could do the same thing. It's not just specific to
convention.
CSS file. It's a convention that we use. You could define templates
Different
that way.
views,
You
yeah.
could define different views, different TypeScript files. So anywhere where it makes sense to branch
Does it
your code.
require you to spell Android right?
Yes.
Okay.
It wouldn't if I had
So
built
you don't
it.
write any
Yeah,
Android
right.
apps.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so I've added some Android-specific styles here. Basically, I changed the background color to white and took away the border because Android buttons are like this battleship gray by default. Reminds a little bit of WinForms. So I'm going to pretty them up a little bit. And then we're going to go back to our component. And we don't have to do this because NativeScript is going to look for this app.css file. And remember, this app.android.css, on Android, this is just going to be app.css. It's going to strip out that platform name. And same for iOS. But just for the sake of being verbose and talking about what we're doing here, we're going to put app CSS here as well. So
That's an Angular feature. You can have multiple style sheets if you want to for a template.
Yes, which is really nice because usually for any component, you're going to have one set of common styles, and then you're going to have some tweaks for Android and some tweaks for iOS.
The other nice thing too is Angular will take care of scoping those styles for you as well.
Yes, so if
So-
you created like all these particular inputs wanted to be yellow background for whatever reason,
Yep.
Yes.
it doesn't bleed into other inputs on the page.
Correct. That's exactly right.
That is a great
did you
feature.
see the style talk from the guy that was, I guess he was right after you?
He was, yes.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Really good stuff.
Yep. And it's up on YouTube too.
Yeah, that's right. So you can see it's already starting to look a lot better than it was before, right? It's
amazing.
Yes, make this thing look so amazing. And we have now these buttons here on the side, and if we click them, actually, it should actually remove this to do, and it does. It's just pulling it out of the. And if I take this here, it lines through. Now we still have these X's here because we haven't explained what all that garbage was that was in our template that didn't look very familiar, and that's because, as you hinted to, it's Font Awesome. So what we're going to do is we're going to install Font Awesome into our application here. So I'm just going to do npm. You can use npm packages inside of NativeScript. Install Font Awesome.
--save.
Dash save.
Which will
Sorry,
save it
let's
for the project
let's do it
later.
again. Or
And so the reason we're doing this is if you're not familiar with npm, basically you're installing packages from the npm repository. If you include the --save flag, it'll save that dependency. And what I mean by that is if you open up your package JSON can you open up the package JSON file?
sure.
Essentially, what it'll do is save this as a dependency. And the reason that's important is that when you go to run npm install again, or if one of your teammates, coworkers goes to run it, that dependency will be saved. So you have like
This avoids the it works on my machine but not yours.
exactly
Right, and actually in this case we don't need --save, and I'll tell you why here in a second. It's because NativeScript, if you're using NativeScript supports icon fonts, which is great because the icon fonts contain most of the icons that you need. You have to use images. So, but in order to do that, we need a new folder and we need to call it fonts, and then we're going to go down here and get this true type font out of Font Awesome here. And we're going to copy it up to that folder. So in this case, you actually would not necessarily need for every single developer
So
to
instead
pull
of
down
installing
Font
on the fly and
Awesome.
getting like new updates for it, you're actually grabbing the font and saving it to part of the project.
Correct, yeah. So we're just going to move this up here. And you can use any icon font this way. You can use Ionicons, you can use Font Awesome, any of the ones that you find that you really like. We're going to paste it in here.
Also note one of my favorite Visual Studio Code features, the fact that you can do that copy and paste right in the sidebar there.
Yeah, that's
It's
really nice.
something that Sublime doesn't do very well, for instance, a lot of other editors.
Yeah, I have to use an extension of Sublime.
And then
to do
Yeah,
it.
you'll see here
exactly.
that we're specifying font family Font Awesome, and it looks a little bit squirrely. And the reason why is because iOS looks for the font family name, and Android looks for the font family file name.
Yeah.
So you have to include both of those in order
And that's
for
just a
both
CSS
platforms.
convention where you can specify one, then the other, and it kind of just goes
Correct,
around.
right, for the different platforms. All right, so now that we've done that, let's go over and see. And sometimes when you add in different files like
The
this,
launcher doesn't pick up the new files.
yes, see,
Yeah.
right here, it's telling me illegal directory read because a new file's been dropped in. So all we're going to do is fire that up again. And fortunately, the live sync's pretty fast, much faster than an actual build. And then we'll come over here.
Yeah, I've built iOS and Android apps. It's not usually that 2-second delay that you're seeing here.
Correct, yeah, it takes much longer when you're actually in Android.
And actually, most of the delay there is we are actually handling the TypeScript compilation for you as well, which is the time that's happening there. Yeah, I mean, it is worth taking a step back here and thinking, like, to build this app normally, I mean, you'd be in Android Studio, you'd be writing Java code to do this. And I mean, to this point, we've been writing...
I wouldn't be because I don't do Java. Yes.
But even though we're using some unfamiliar UI components, we're still using Angular 2 to build this thing.
Yeah, and there's other stuff here I'm noticing that as you're talking about, there are conventions that you guys have adopted, like the fonts and things like that you're adopting in here, and the naming convention for Android or iOS. that come with it that aren't Angular specific, and they're not even iOS, Android specific. There's things that you guys have done, it seems like, to make it easier
Correct.
to target multi-platforms.
Right. So because to say that you're going to build a native app and it's just you're going to write all the same code, all the same styles, it's going to work the same on both platforms, just isn't the reality. The platforms are very similar, but they're not identical. So you have to be able to target platform-specific things.
You also give the ability now to target UX slightly different.
Yes.
Different platforms, which is a big thing for UX folks to be able to do.
Very important, because you may have a completely material design implementation on Android, and your iOS may be completely different.
Yes.
Yeah. And so you can see it already looks a whole lot better, right? Like we have these icons here. And so if we went over and looked at Font Awesome real quick, as I just want to show this so that we understand why things are the way that they are. So we'll go to the Font Awesome website, and we'll look at one of these fonts here.
And
Yeah. Font Awesome, you have codes, right, where you associate them with icons.
That is exactly right. And so we can search, let's like just take this Envira icon.
Sure.
Right, so the Unicode is what you have to use in order to get that actual icon. In NativeScript, you can use the Unicode, but you have to escape the Unicode, and that's what this is right here. What you'll see is a $&X, the Unicode, and then a semicolon to terminate the statement.
Okay.
So it's just an escape sequence. It looks odd at first, but once you memorize it, no big deal.
You could even mask those if you wanted to. So you could like create a file of constants for all your icons.
And
just
actually,
refer to them.
there's a plugin, so you can do TNS plugin add font awesome, and somebody has actually already done that, and it gives you a file full of constants, and you can just reference the constant instead.
Yeah, because you could easily mistype that and get the wrong icon.
and it's more readable too. Like
Yes.
one of your coworkers might not like to pull in this file.
It's called job security, right?
Yeah.
All right, so let's look at this real
Could we write the
quick.
entire app in Unicode?
We've already done the style URL. Yeah, well, actually, you probably could. I'm just not that good. You're that good, John. All right, so let's do, I think we are already ready to the place where we can go ahead and copy some code straight off the web and see if this works. So I'm going to come back here to this is the web implementation using Angular 2 for ToDo MVC. And actually, did I get to the right one here? There we go. So this is the implementation here. Looks somewhat similar to what we've got. And then I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go to the source for this thing. And I want to point out that the source for this thing contains two files of note. The first one is this app.ts file, which is going to look somewhat similar to ours, although ours looks a little bit different because we don't have this full implementation.
Yeah, they've got all sorts of different features here.
Right, we're not going to build this entire thing just because we don't have time. But one of the things they do have is a service here, and we have this store.ts file. And in here, you see that to-do class that we had before, and then a to-do store. And the to-do store is going to handle all of the actual adding, removing, saving things to disk, and so the component is not responsible for that. So what I'm going to
Disk, you mean
do...
like local storage.
to local
Ah,
storage,
okay.
right. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get raw here, and I'm going to copy this.
So that's a question for you while he's doing this. The local storage, is that going to be the browser local storage, or is that going to be, because we're not in a browser?
Yes, that's a very good question.
Yes, it's a very good leading question.
Yes. Good segue, John. So
And that's
let's...
all the time we have.
All right, so let's do that. Let's go and create a services folder here. So I'm just going to go app, new folder, services, and then we're going to put a new to-do service inside. So todo.ts, and then we're just going to paste in verbatim everything from the web for this to-do store. And then we're going to come up here to the top, and we're going to... Do I need to include the Angular core here for the component? No, I don't. I
Only
do
just
need
something
to
in there.
include...
You're going to make it injectable.
Yes,
right?
we
So
do
you
need
the import.
And this is, I don't understand why the web version does not make this thing injectable. But what it should do is we should have import injectable from... Right. And then we want to come down here. We're going to inject this thing into our component. So we want to make it injectable here. Right, like that.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to come back over to our app component here.
Because you're going to inject the to-do store.
We're going to
too.
inject, that's exactly what we're going to
And
do.
by the way, injectable on that doesn't mean that that guy's injectable. It means that it itself has things that get injected into it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wish it was named that, actually.
And is it though like is it a convention though like for Style Guide to just mark all of your services that way regardless of what you
Yes,
intend to use
because
it that way?
otherwise you have to try to figure out, does this class have things in its constructor that have to be injected or doesn't it?
Right.
And what if it doesn't today but it does tomorrow? So if you just always stick the injectable on any class you're going to use with constructors, with that has things, like you've got stuff in your constructor that gets injected, then you'll need that.
Okay.
All right, so now for our constructor, we're actually going to say we're going to say we have a to-do store of type to-do store. And then down here, we're going to say that our to-do store now equals this to-do store that we just passed in. And we're going to come up here and say this thing is of type.
It's no longer an array. Now it's your thingy.
Now it's my to-do
But see,
store.
that's what's great about TypeScript.
Yep.
It
Yeah,
tells you
just
you're about
showed
to
me.
screw up.
Yes.
Hey, Burke, stop.
Yes.
Yeah.
You learn to love it.
And you got a push problem.
Yeah,
The API is
we're
different.
going to address that here in just a second because we have to refactor that a little bit. So now what Angular 2 is going to do for us is it's going to look at this constructor. It's going to know that we need to pass this in. But in order for us to do that, we need to specify a provider here. So we need to say that our providers we're going to use to-do store. And then Angular 2 is going to take care of doing new to-do store, passing that into our constructor so that we can then set those things equal and get a reference to it.
Right, you're
It's
telling
really nice.
Angular, providers tells Angular that the to-do store exists.
Right.
So when you ask for it in the constructor on line 13, it's going to say, okay, I know Angular, I need this guy. And it's going to go, oh yeah, it's right there.
Right. And one of the things that we kind of agreed upon internally is that dependency injection is one of those things that you don't think you need until your app gets really big or you need to test it. And at least one of those things is very likely to happen. And so Angular 2 is built on dependency injection, and we're going to use it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, because you could have just said, like you said, you could have just forgone all that stuff, and inside your class app component, you could have said, hey, create a new instance of to-do store. Yeah. But doing it this way, you're decoupling it.
Right. We're not using the new keyword, which in object-oriented programming in general, you try to steer clear of saying new anything because that's a tight coupling. And interfaces would actually go a long way towards making this even further decoupled. All right, so let's go back to our to-do TS. Let me save this. And we're going to jump back here for a second. And what I want to do is talk about this local storage question that you asked. So if we go down here, we're not getting an error, but NativeScript does not have a local storage. But it does have something called application settings, which is nearly identical. So what we're going to do is import star as, and I'm just going to call it local storage to keep the API the same, from application settings. Now, when I pull this in right here, you'll notice that TypeScript is cool with this. Where is this coming from? This is coming from, and we'll scroll down here to the node modules. And if we go down, there's a TNS module, core modules folder. And inside of here, you'll find all sorts of stuff, right? This is all the native access that we provide wrappers for. Now, you can write native code at any time in your JavaScript, but we provide you some nice abstractions here. So you have color, camera, connectivity, CSS, data, file system if you wanted to do that, HTTP, and then a lot of this stuff is in the UI folder. So here's where you'll find all the UI components that we provide right out of the box.
If you had like accelerometer and things like that, where would you find that kind of stuff?
That stuff would be, you would do, we have a plugin for accelerometer, I believe.
Yep. So on top of this, so these are the ones that we provide as the NativeScript team out of the box. So you can find them. They're in our GitHub repo, GitHub /NativeScript/NativeScript. The NativeScript community, though, builds a lot of plugins on top of this. So there is already an accelerometer plugin. You could head out to NPM, search for NativeScript.
Yeah, you can do npm install, and I think it's called NativeScript accelerometer.
I don't know how to spell it.
Okay, so by having these in other packages, though, I'm guessing the reason these are in other packages, you don't want to pull in stuff that you're not possibly going to be using too.
Correct, because all of this JavaScript code, again, will go onto your device. We're just
So you pull in
there.
the native features that you want to use on your phone, anything that's not out of the box, and you guys probably get the most common ones that you're definitely want, like a button.
Yep, exactly.
Right? You're not going to make somebody go get the button. You've got the button.
Yep.
But anything else that's on there, you're going to say, oh, if you want to get those, you have to npm install them, and then you can import them.
Correct.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now that we've got this local storage here, the only thing we need to change is you'll see that TypeScript's already telling us this local storage does not have a get item. And that's because it has a get boolean, get number, get string, because it knows about types. So if we want to use it like local storage, we can just say get string. And you'll notice that this JSON.parse, you can still use the JSON API in NativeScript just like you would in the browser. So that doesn't change. And then the only other thing we need to do is instead of set item, it would be set string. And that's it. We've totally replicated local storage on NativeScript.
And the reason you can call it local storage is if you scroll back up the top, is because you just basically said, take the thing out of NativeScript's application settings and just call it local storage.
Just call it local storage. And really, if you were doing this thing right, you would create a module called local storage, and you would probably wrap that get and set so that it was completely identical. All right, so now we've changed that. Let's jump over to our app component. We need to change a few things. So we don't have an add to do anymore, right? This is now in the to-do store. So instead, what we want to do is say this.to-do store, to-do store.add. There's an add method. This is why I love TypeScript, man. And then
memorize your APIs.
Right. And then we're going to push in and see it's telling me it wants a title, type of string. I got one of those. New to-do text. We're going to get rid of this. And then we're good to go. That's been completely refactored. And then we just need to do the same thing for remove. So now instead of having to do all this splicing here, we're just going to do this.to-do store remove, and it's going to say, what do you want? Which to-do do you want to remove? The one that I'm passing in. And we have now completely refactored this application to use this to-do store service that we copied in almost verbatim from the web version of Angular 2.
And the only real change you made to the code that you pulled in was the local storage.
That is correct, yeah.
And in general, when you're trying to reuse code between your native apps with NativeScript and your web apps, the idea is if you write your services in a way that's not tied to the browser anywhere, not tied to any specific UI for that matter. For instance, with NativeScript, we re-implement the Angular's HTTP service so that you can use that and not need to care whether that's being implemented by the Angular team with XML HTTP requests or being implemented by us with just native iOS and Android code needed to do that sort of thing.
So are you saying that I could import the the @Angular/HTTP library and use those native APIs and then call those, and you guys will?
It would work out of the box,
Nice.
web app and native app, yes.
Does that work with any Angular package effectively?
It should, yeah. I mean, there are some slight differences. Like, for instance, the router is a little bit different because if you just think about routing, the way it works is just a little bit different with native and web apps.
So you wouldn't use the router here, I'm assuming.
So you would use the router, but what we do is we provide what we call a page router outlet that builds on top of the router outlet,
that's what
so
you're
that you can use basically the same APIs, but let us handle the native nuances of how these
Because
things
it doesn't work the same, is kind of my point. The router in a web browser uses history and all that other stuff that's in there, and in a native app, you don't have that.
Yep.
So you're just, where that doesn't exist, I'm assuming you're just basically replacing that functionality.
Yeah, we're doing the best we can to sort of replicate that
Okay.
so that you can use the same APIs, but still build for the native platforms.
Awesome.
So I wanted to show everybody this because if you do Angular 2, you're going to hit this error. And Ward Bell actually originally opened this issue, and I got on there and commented as well because it's very hard to understand. So first, the thing you'll notice is that NativeScript's pretty good about handling the stack trace, right? It's just going to spit it out into your app and say, you got an error, here's what it is. You can see here that it's actually pointing to our app HTML, line 314, cannot find a differ supporting object of type object.
Duh.
Right? That doesn't mean anything. Let me just say,
The key word there is the NG4.
NG4, correct. When you see this error, what this means is you're trying to iterate over something that Angular 2 cannot iterate over.
And that makes sense because we had an array before.
That's right, and now we have an object. So what we're going to do is jump over to our HTML, and we're going to say, if you remember, we called it to-do store, and then inside of to-do store, the actual
items or
array,
to-dos
it's
or-
to-dos. Correct. And so that will then allow us to run this thing, and we won't get this error.
So if we kind of jumped ahead a little bit fast here to keep moving, but if we had, instead of going right to the web and pulling the code in, if we had stopped for a moment after your first implementation and created a to-do store service of our own and implemented it with the array, for example, first, this code would have been an array. The only thing we would have had to change is this code already had a to-dos property. The only thing we had to change when we pulled in the code from the web was literally just the local storage.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And this thing, of course, still works. And you'll notice that if we kill this thing and bring it back, because we're saving to application settings and local storage, all of these items will be there if you tombstone or even close this application and then bring it all the way back. The last thing that I want to show people, because I know we're running short on time, is debugging. So we provide an extension for NativeScript that allows you to debug inside of Visual Studio Code. So for instance, maybe you want to, when an item is added, you want to break on that and look at that.
I want to see that.
Okay, so we're going to click this bug icon here. And the first thing that we need to do is create a debug profile for NativeScript. So we're going to click on this, and again, to install this, you would go extensions, install extension, and then you just search for NativeScript, and it's just in the store, or is that what they call that? The Visual
Marketplace.
Gallery, Marketplace. And again, this is open source as well.
You
so
just click download and you're good.
Yep.
This is a free extension, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because some are paid.
No, this is
This
free.
is free.
You
Yeah.
also get some nice snippets too.
Yeah, we get some snippets as well. So we'll choose NativeScript, and what that does is creates a debug profile over here. We're not going to go into this, but you can find this file inside your VS Code folder here.
Will
If
it
you
work
don't
out of
have
the
one-
box as configured?
Yep.
Nice.
Yeah, it's kind of scary actually. All right, so now that we've got that done, we want to actually set a breakpoint. So let's go back over to our app component here.
Yeah, because when somebody says to me,
And-
hey, you don't have to worry about this file. I only don't worry about it if I don't have to touch it.
Right, exactly.
So-
Yes, it's already ready already. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and we're going to save this, and then we're going to come over here, and we're just going to choose launch on. We have a couple different, lots of options. So you can do it on device, on emulator. If you have an already running instance, you can just attach the debugger to a running emulator. But we're going to launch on the Android emulator here.
So we had an emulator running a moment ago. We could have then attached to the one that was running.
The first time that you do the debugger, you need to launch, but every additional time after that, you could, because then you can stop the debugger, make a change, live sync, and then reattach the debugger so that the iteration is
related to
faster.
how I do like node debugging out of VS Code. Like, I attach to it, but it only works attaching if I'm on the same port. Like, you have to have a debug port that you can actually attach to. So I'm assuming then the way you launch your
I think that
emulator
it might actually work the exact same way.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the specifics.
Okay.
I know one of the reasons that all of this is possible is, again, because we're using JavaScript. We're using JavaScript virtual machines, and these things have APIs to make this sort of thing possible. It's the same sort of way that you can do remote debugging for your mobile web apps, for instance, through like the Chrome debug tools or the Safari Web Inspector. The same sort of APIs is what we're using under the hood to make it possible to run this in VS Code.
Right, and the first time that we run this for Android, it is going to take a little bit of time, the same way that if we were in Android Studio, because we're basically doing a full build here, as opposed to the live sync before, where we said we already did a full build, just look at the differences and change that, which would be either the TypeScript, the CSS, or the actual markup here.
Now, if while this is working, could I attach a device and also debug in the device with this?
Yes.
Nice.
And actually, for the Telerik platform, you can attach a device and debug inside of Visual Studio, so you can step through inside of, and of course, Visual Studio on Windows, there's no iOS emulator, so you can't, debug through your emulator, but you definitely can with the
with VS Code we can do that, though.
Yes, and it's trying to start my the wrong emulator here, so let's stop this here.
Emulator.
Yeah, I called it. Well, I was using the original Android emulator that comes with the SDK, which is a miserable experience, and so then I got started with Genymotion, which is much faster. But Microsoft also has an excellent Android emulator. Have you used it?
I have not, but I've seen they pulled it out.
It's fantastic.
Supposedly, the latest version of Android has far faster emulators as well, although I have yet to try them to see if that's actually true.
Yep. So hopefully we'll get this running here, and if not, we'll skip right over. So for people that want to see a full implementation of this, you can go to github.com/myself, and you can go to repositories, and you can look at NativeScript Angular ToDo. And inside of here, you'll have the complete ToDo app. So we're including a pipe here so that we can show just completed items, just active items, or all items. We've added some animations for when you add and remove items. We've actually broken out and have some shared components. So we have like a filter component. We have a footer component, so you can see how you break out your different UI pieces and put them into different folders.
That's good, because you still get Angular 2. The big thing of it is the component tree. You want to have a component hierarchy, make them composable.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So my VS Code is going to begin looking for an emulator that's it's not going to find. Yeah, so we can't show darn emulator. So we can't show the debugging. But if you go to, the best way to do this is go to NativeScript.org, NativeScript.org, and then you go to developers, and you can do VS Code with NativeScript. And if you scroll down to the bottom here, we have a nifty video that will show you how to do the debugging in NativeScript with VS Code and how that works with the emulator, because it's really nice.
So while it's suffering for a moment, can we go back to VS Code for a moment?
Absolutely.
Because I'd like to see just some settings there. Can you actually navigate files while it's looking?
Yes, absolutely, you can.
Let's go to that launch JSON for a moment.
Okay.
The file we said we wouldn't look at.
This in here, this here.
Yes. So if we look down there and get rid of the debug console, we can actually see. Somewhere in here, I assume you would tell it what emulator to use?
No, it will automatically. So I said, what did I say over here? Did I say launch on Android? Oh, so I needed to say launch on Android device.
Okay,
that's why. Yes, because if you say the emulator, I think it automatically looks for the default Android emulator, and for me, that's the Android emulator.
So there's got to be a way to tell it to go somewhere else.
Correct.
The device is going to go to whatever.
Jeez, John, you're good at this.
Yeah, and
I come work on the NativeScript team.
I didn't even think. I didn't even think about this, but basically, to the Android. So under the hood, we're using the Android CLI ADB to actually send these things out to emulators and devices. And the Android CLI sees the Genymotion emulator as basically a USB connected Android device.
Yeah, and if
it doesn't see it because
it's not a device. That's why I'm confused.
Well, to the Android CLI, an emulator is an AVD, an Android virtual device. And Genymotion it sees as it's basically like a plugged-in device that you have running.
All right, so we've already, what it does by default is it breaks on the first line of the application. Now for us, that's a lot of stuff that we don't really care about because it's an internal file.
And that's JavaScript.
That is correct.
It's the TypeScript generated, yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to go continue here. And if you remember, we created a breakpoint on app.component.ts right here.
I don't remember, but I believe
it's right there. Yeah, we've been through a lot since all this. And then we're going to come over here, and we're just going to add in a new item. And when we do that, it's going to break right into VS Code, which is crazy.
Wait a minute. Hold on. This is breaking a TypeScript, which is what I want. But a moment ago, it was showing me the JavaScript.
Well, because that was an internal file. When we ship the internal files, we don't ship the TypeScript. We ship the actual JavaScript.
So that's good news, because it scared me for a minute. I was thinking it wasn't going to use the source maps.
No. Yes,
So
it's using source maps. Yes, and again, source maps something we take care of for you. They're just always generated. You just code. And then you can see here, we can actually look at this object. So we can look inside of this, the context of this. We're adding this new to do text here, this dot new to do text. We can come over here and we can add a watch here. So we can say we want to watch this item.
So the full debugging stuff you got to VS Code.
Yes,
works.
and then we can come down here in the console and say this, and it's an app component. We could say this dot new to do text, and it'll give us that. We can even say this dot new to do text equals I changed it, right? And then let's go ahead and step over, and you can see over here on the side it actually now says I changed it. And if we continue on,
That'll
come
show
back
up
here.
inside the emulator.
And we want to, okay, wait. Yeah, Android is not okay with waiting on the debugger for whatever reason.
Are you still there?
Yeah, exactly. You want to wait? You want to close. But yes, you can actually change items in the debugger. You get the full debugging experience that you would expect with a step debugger, which is
awesome.
We're not really aware of any other extensions inside of Visual Studio Code that are available for Visual Studio Code that do this. So there we go. That's our whirlwind tour through Angular 2 and NativeScript. If you want to,
and it only costs $5 million, right?
That's correct. Yeah, you can send that check to TJ.
Yeah, my offshore bank account.
Right.
Oh, great.
So we can go to nativescript.org/ not all of this. Let's take all this out. We can just do ngconf because that's where we are. And
so if you're in Africa, you just type /Africa.
Well, no, it doesn't quite work that way. Be cool if it did though. And you can click this Get Started button up here at the top, and we'll take you to the documentation here.
Yep, and the tutorial that's at the bottom there.
Get started with TypeScript and Angular.
Is that basically what we just did? Or is
It's
it a different tutorial.
It's much more comprehensive. So we're going to teach you not just Angular 2, but all about NativeScript, all about plugins, all about...
Nice.
Yes.
And also how to architect your code. So if you're looking to use Angular 2, if you're building for the web and for native apps as well, we'll have a little discussion of the best way to structure your code to get to that point.
It also goes through how you use some of these things like gestures and whatnot as well.
Yeah. Contains, yeah, goes through all the components.
Because you're going to build a mobile app, you're going to want to take advantage of mobile-specific things.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's an important note, too, is, I mean, if you're going to go through the hassle of building an iOS or Android app, I mean, you're building on very powerful devices and devices that work differently from the web. Mm-hmm. So it really behooves you to take advantage of that sort of thing, to push the limits of what you can do.
It does. I mean, if you're building a web app, if you're building an app for NativeScript, that's going to be native. And all you're going to do, literally, is create a to-do. Probably not the greatest choice in the world, because if you're going to take advantage of things around the device and you want it to be pure native, I mean, and that's what you really have to think about when you're building an app. You got to think: do I want to build something that's actually going to take advantage of the device? If so.
So, for instance, like if I'm building a to-do list that I want to be really native, I'd add like a pull to refresh to it. I'd make it an endless scroll list. I'd add some swipe action so I could swipe to remove the things. I'd add a native sharing widget so I could share my to-do list natively with my friends. So start to think in a different way than when you're building a web app.
And I'm thinking for those who do like Ionic, a lot of what you've got with these hooks into the native features. For Ionic folks who knows that, there's like ng Cordova in Ionic 1, for example. That stuff's built in Ionic 2. But those are the things that you use. They're basically directives in Angular 1's Ionic that allow you to talk to the device. So they have directives that do that. You guys have these other hooks, basically modules. Now you just say, go to my application settings or
correct.
Whatever else.
The only difference is the one thing that we didn't cover is that if there was something that you wanted to call, like if you wanted to say, get an instance to the navigation controller or create a custom app delegate, you would just do that inside of JavaScript, inside of NativeScript. Okay. So if there's something that we don't offer a wrapper for or a plugin for, you can go to the docs on either platform, look at those, and then just write that code in JavaScript.
Yeah, one kind of cool thing we provide is we actually have TypeScript declarations, so the .d.ts files for the entirety of iOS and Android that you can use.
Sweet.
Yeah.
It's really awesome.
So you don't have to hunt and peck and try to figure out what is that thing called.
Right.
So you get sort of like, it's an advanced usage scenario, right? Because most people don't want to go into the raw iOS and Android APIs. But
That's me.
But when you're in that scenario where you have that very specific use case, right? Like your CEO says, like, I saw this iOS app that does this and I need it, right? you always have access to those things so that you can use
So that's a
them.
good
within
question.
your
A
apps.
question I get a lot by these other platforms, like the Onyx, because I'm more familiar with that, is if somebody's using that. So imagine your director comes down and says, I want to use NativeScript to do this, but there's a new version of iOS that just came out. Usually some of these other platforms, they come out right away with like a day later, they've got the API you can use to talk to it.
Yep.
How soon after like a new iOS feature comes out will NativeScript generally have that?
We call it 0-day support, that's because we're reflecting over those things and generating that API for you on the fly. So, for instance, like when Android N came out, the same day that it came out, we were able to run NativeScript on Android N.
That's awesome. So it's
Yes.
not like you have to go code that thing up.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yep,
So
exactly.
just as an example here, I'll show you. This is the Kiva demo that we saw earlier today. This is their application. And you can see down here that we're doing some things here, and I don't have the definition
typings.
files.
Yeah.
But you can see here I'm actually creating a custom application delegate so that I can set the status bar style across the entire application. Now, normally, you wouldn't do this, but if your application required you to have some custom status bar style, you can do it. So I'm actually calling all native APIs here, and of course we document all of this so that you don't have to guess and be like, well, I never would have known, like static
Application
Objective-C
did
protocol.
finish launch
Yeah.
with options.
So if you go to the docs, you just search for app delegate, then we'll just give you a template for an app delegate. You copy paste and you change what you need, and you're good to go.
And I do want to make clear, I mean, this is certainly an advanced thing. This is
Yes.
not something, this is going to be if you have to write this code at all, it's going to be a small fraction of your code. The most important part here is we wanted to give people an option so that you're never restricted by NativeScript. So NativeScript isn't keeping you from doing something that you really need to do. And it can be powerful if your company does have a bit of Android and iOS experience. Maybe you've got an iOS specialist in-house and really wants to customize your app to really fine-tune it. You're able to do that in NativeScript just directly out of the box, and in TypeScript code as well.
All right, well, I've got 18 minutes left on my battery, and I've got to get
I have
done.
19 minutes of questions.
I know. And now you've got to be somewhere.
I do.
And so do you. You've got a
That's
panel
true.
to be on.
Yep.
So, John, thanks so much for joining us. And for those that are watching, we hope that you'll go to nativescript.org and give it a try.
Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.